So along these lines of seeing the world and indeed wilderness as something that is separating or separated from human beings, I like to provide a couple of ethnographic examples from quite different parts of the world to show how some of this works. We can also see this in one of the assigned readings on Our Common Future, which looks at how visitors are treated to parks in both China as well as Russia, and how those are very different experiences in the particular setting, with Russia being much more about survival and this idea of wilderness, and the Chinese model in Our Common Future being talked about as almost a quasi Disney World, Disneyland type of vacation or trip, complete with turnstiles, particular sites for photographs to be taken and whatnot. So the first ethnographic example I'd really like to dive into a little bit of depth here comes from Bilal work, and he's a geographer. And he's done work on the commoditization of the safari and the safari experience. And the commoditization of the safari goes to the notion of essentially seeing charismatic megafauna or big game. This becomes a really unique and distinctive event for tourists from the United States as well as Europe to see charismatic megafauna that they would not otherwise be able to see. And so much of the luxury vacations turn around this idea of going out on safari in actual vans or SUVs to see the wildlife in its pristine habitat. And again, these are very high level in terms of income, in terms of traveling to from the United States to Kenya and other locations to see these charismatic megafauna, and these become central to creating a unique visitor experience that cannot be replicated elsewhere. Often tour guides will be given additional monies for being able to spot all five of the charismatic megafauna, or what are referred to as the Big Five. At the same time, any signs of human beings in the Masai Mara Reserve are frowned upon. And this leads to some real tension that exists between tourists and those that cater to tourists, such as tour guides, park rangers, associated hotel industries, and some of the local inhabitants, the Maasai who live in the region, who do things like raise cattle. Because the presence of cattle is distinctly marked as something as a domesticate, as not wild, and hence not authentic to the safari experience. The tourist is not expecting to see what is a rather frequent contemporary as well as historical event of cattle grazing on the Masai Mara Reserve. Indeed, as Bilal argues, much of what we see as the Masai Mara Reserve is a wilderness area, as something that's uniquely wild, is in fact the product of long-term geologic changes as well as human interactions on the environment that involve particularly the grazing of cattle on what is today park lands. And here you can see a couple of the pictures, indeed juxtaposing some of the wildlife along with the cattle on the reserve itself. And this has been seen as a point of real tension for tourists who often stay in luxury resorts, often oases in the middle of an otherwise rather sparse environment in terms of water resources, as being rather limited in many of these regions. And so when they go out, these tourists go out and they go on safari, and they see Maasai people out grazing cattle, something really strikes them as inauthentic, as a violation that has occurred, because you have this very domesticated task here, this taming of nature that is juxtaposed with this idea of wilderness. And this certainly, with thinking about this in the context of the United States, things like national parks as areas which prohibit, for the most part, use of the resources in the parks to very limited types of interactions with the environment that are acceptable. And so in the park, you have individuals that are tourists going and complaining to tour operators who will in turn, and hotel operators who will in turn complain to the guards. The guards have been, as Bilal discusses, they've been implicated in several human rights abuses of Maasai, including the use of physical violence against the Maasai who violate the park boundaries. Now, interestingly enough, as Butt points out, the management of the park has shifted quite a bit over time. So we see guards coming into the area and then not stationed in an area for too long, otherwise they'd be so-called corrupted or being able to be influenced by the local populations. Whereas historically, before the development of the tourist industry in the Masai Mara Reserve, you see quite a bit of permissiveness in terms of park rangers, park wardens allowing the Maasai to graze cattle on the land. And so this violence that's enacted upon the Maasai and their historic homeland is the result of the transnational industry in the production of these lands as a consumptive space for tourists to see what it is they are expecting to see. And what it is they're expecting to see is, of course, a product of the tourist industry itself and how it markets the particular experience as authentic. Moving to an area of the world that is likely much more familiar to many of you, the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area, which is right down Route 80, Interstate 80, going into the Stroudsburgs and then heading up Route 209 through Pennsylvania or on the Jersey side into Water Gap and then on up on River Road and some of the back roads out there. The Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area is 70,000 square acres of land that's located along both the Pennsylvania and New Jersey sides of the Delaware River. It provides scenic vistas and has historically been utilized as a tourist destination for those from New York City as well as surrounding areas. But a lot of what we see today and a lot of how the park represents itself doesn't tell the full story of the history of Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. In fact, I grew up in the area to the right there. You see Hackers Falls, which is probably one of my favorite areas in the world. So this park provides many opportunities for things like cycling, road cycling, mountain biking, hiking, trail running, swimming, various rafting activities, canoeing, and just a number of recreational opportunities for those in the surrounding area, as well as, of course, providing area for deer to graze. Now, before the park, agriculture was quite extensive along the Delaware Water Gap, what is today the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area, in what Nancy Michael Shakaitis calls the Lower Minnesink. And the farms were fairly active up until the 1930s and 40s, and you started to see farmers going out of business or utilizing their farms in unison with other operations, such as tourist operations in the area, having boarding houses for individuals to spend some time. The park was also known for its industry historically. There are a number of mills that are located around the park and in the surrounding areas, as well as within the park. Log floating was quite extensive. I mentioned earlier Gifford Pinchot's historical relationship with the land, his grandfather and father being involved in the logging industry, and Gifford Pinchot really seeing the diminishment of resources in the area as a whole. There were complete services, including a number of ferries across the Delaware, of course schools. There was a railroad that connected Bushkill with Stroudsburg, and then, of course, Route 209 and associated businesses, Bushkill and Dingman's Ferry on the Pennsylvania side of the border. The flood of 1955 reawakened interest in damming the Delaware. The flood caused a number of deaths. A lot of these were along Broadhead Creek, which didn't really have anything specifically to do with the Delaware itself. It was just a matter of water flowing down a small canyon that didn't really allow anywhere for the water to go. Those waters came rather rapidly and actually caused much of the damage and particularly loss of human life as a whole. Nevertheless, the flooding of 1955 reinvigorated efforts and discussion about the dam, particularly the Tox Island Dam. This was to be located along the Delaware. It was an earthen dam that was to span from one side to the other at the end of the base of Tox Island itself. There have been numerous geological studies that have been done that had determined that the site was structurally unsound. Nevertheless, discussion still progressed. And they progressed to such a point that there was the discussion about the development of Tox Island National Recreation Area with the dam backing up the waters and creating recreational sites all along the Delaware River. And so the movement moved forward in terms of declaring eminent domain and taking individuals, households, farms, and indeed entire communities were destroyed overall. The notion of eminent domain went around the notion of fair market value, and there was a lot of discussion about what fair market value actually was and how the land had to be constituted, whether this was something that was along the river, which would in a market yield a higher return, or something on the mountains, which would have less money overall per acre. However, many of the representatives of the federal government, either the Army Corps of Engineers or the Department of Interior and National Park Service, when they came in and made the offers, they were making offers based on the lower land value. They rarely took into account improvements on the land, including the housing structures, agriculture, fruit trees, other things that had been planted or developed, the development of the soil. All of these things were rather marginalized in economic calculations. And so there was lots of discussion with the individuals that I spoke with about what it actually constituted determining a fair price for the products. And often they would resist to a certain extent, not taking the first offer. But if they refused to take the second offer, a lawyer was often taken, came into the situation. And there's a number of issues with things like salvage rights. Most reported that they were able to salvage and access some of the materials in their homes, at least in terms of the timing. There were gutting of a lot of really old homes, which were very aesthetically pleasing. And then also the movement of squatters that was initiated through the Village Voice in New York. You started to see a number of squatters coming out and creating essentially communes in what had been these old communities, these old towns along the Delaware. And this really raised the ire of a lot of local inhabitants who had the federal government come and take the land from them, but then subsequently did not evict the squatters in a timely fashion. The squatters, of course, had many reports that they were active in a number of illegal activities in the region, and really raised the tension overall between the federal government and the local residents as a whole, tension that still remains in this area to this day. From talking about to individuals, there was notions of varying degrees of loss. Some said it wasn't tragic in relation to being able to preserve the overall wilderness character of the environment. Some equated the eviction to the death of relatives whose heart was broken by what they saw as the government essentially turning the back on those that had dedicated their lives to serving the country in the military, for example. Again, the continuing distrust of the National Park Service and the government as a whole remains in the area. Some did see it as a necessary displacement for what was in the area today, rather than a series of strip malls, hotels, and associated commercial industry. Others expressed concern for the future, and that the Delaware Water Gap as a whole is under continuing threat. So some of the issues that have emerged recently in the area have been the flooding, with the hurricanes in the area, the development of Marcellus Shale, and the rerouting of a pipeline that was to replace a pipeline in the Water Gap National Recreation Area itself, and was diverted through 8 miles of some older growth forest in the Milford, Matamoros, Westfall area. So this continues to be a major concern overall today. There's also concern amongst local residents that Route 209 will be privatized and individuals will have to be charged in order to progress through there. So I hope to have provided you with an overview of our place in the environment in a historic context, looking at the science of ecology, the environmental movement, law, and policy, and an examination of a couple case studies from the Safari and Delaware Water Gap.